In modern society, the first question we usually ask someone is, "What do you do?" Our personal identities have become intertwined with our job titles and our economic output, fueling a massive, exhausting epidemic of burnout. We carry our offices in our pockets. While the gig economy and smartphones promised flexibility, they effectively erased the boundaries of the workday. We traded human bosses for push notifications, turning independent workers into subjects of a relentless algorithm. This friction between human limits and endless production is an old problem. During the 19th century Industrial Revolution, capitalism functioned as a dominant religion. The skyline of the city shifted as the towering spires of cathedrals were overshadowed by the dark smokestacks of massive factories. Industrialists demanded extreme quotas, enforcing 16-hour shifts in dangerous conditions. Human beings, including children working the textile looms, were reduced to operational costs on a balance sheet. When a system evaluates a human life purely by its capacity to generate profit, it inevitably grinds the worker to dust. It is the foundational crisis of a culture obsessed with production. In the early days of industrialization, wealthy factory owners were often the biggest financial donors to local parishes. Consequently, the early church largely stayed quiet, preaching endurance to the impoverished and promising them that earthly suffering would yield rewards in the afterlife. But as grueling labor, starvation, and disease spread through slum neighborhoods like New York's Hell's Kitchen, pastors working directly with the poor hit a breaking point. Theology had to answer the reality on the streets. Religious leaders developed the concept of structural sin. They argued that evil isn't limited to individual choices. An entire economic system can be inherently exploitative. The new mandate became fighting for economic justice on earth. By framing extreme labor as a moral failure of the system, this theological pivot provided the moral ammunition needed to ignite the modern labor movement. The social gospel movement looked at the ancient biblical mandate of the Sabbath, the law that both masters and servants must rest on the seventh day. They weaponized this scripture against industry leaders to demand an 8-hour workday. The world's largest Christian institution soon entered the fight. In 1891, Pope Leo XIII observed the immense friction between labor and capital and issued a landmark encyclical called Rerum Novarum. The document explicitly condemned the unchecked greed of capitalism. It established as formal doctrine that workers possess a divine right to unionize, and it introduced the concept of the living wage, dictating that pay must be high enough to support a family with dignity. Church doctrine moved quickly into the streets. During the 1894 Pullman strike, clergy physically stepped out of their sanctuaries and stood directly between striking railway workers and the rifles of federal troops. The weekend and the 40-hour workweek survive today as blood-bought artifacts of this theological resistance. When 146 garment workers died in the Triangle Shirtwaist factory because management had locked the exit doors, religious leaders refused to call it an accident. They stepped to the pulpit and declared the corporate negligence systematic murder. Decades later, during the Great Depression, Catholic convert Dorothy Day demonstrated that faith required direct physical action. Her Catholic worker movement built houses of hospitality, feeding and sheltering striking workers when they had nothing left. By the time of the Civil Rights era, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. argued that racism and economic exploitation were twin evils. To defeat one, you had to dismantle the other. During the 1968 Memphis sanitation strike, Black workers marched down the street holding signs reading, "I am a man." This was a direct invocation of Imago Dei, the belief that even the lowest paid labor holds inherent dignity, as humans are made in God's image. By aligning with secular unions and social reformers, these religious leaders helped anchor the 20th century labor movement in the conviction that human beings are sacred creations, rather than disposable inventory. By the 1980s, financial markets adopted a rigid new philosophy, the absolute worship of shareholder value. Corporate greed returned with aggressive authority. Simultaneously, a new cultural ideology gained traction, the prosperity gospel. It falsely equated individual wealth with divine blessing and quietly shifted the blame for poverty directly onto the individual. As pulpits grew silent on fair wages and unions faced severe dismantling, the structural protections for workers rapidly eroded. This ideological regression cleared the path for the unchecked exploitation of today's gig economy. But the friction is returning. Today, warehouse employees and delivery drivers are walking out, striking against megacorporations to demand the fair wages and safety promised by earlier movements. Abandoning the moral and theological roots of labor rights left the modern worker completely defenseless against renewed commodification. Today, we face an era where artificial intelligence can automate complex tasks that once defined the modern workforce. If a machine or an algorithm can replicate your labor in a fraction of a second, we have to ask a difficult question. What is the source of your dignity if it is no longer your economic output? To survive the cult of production, we have to look back to the ancient ideas of limits and grace found in the Sabbath. We must decouple our basic right to exist from our capacity for endless toil. In a hyper-capitalist world that demands constant, measurable output, intentionally shutting down your screen and doing absolutely nothing is the ultimate act of rebellion. It proves your worth is inherent, not profitable.